Hi, this is Professor Stucard, and in this brief video we will be discussing formatting and the style we should use in writing code. So the main goal for this particular lecture is just understanding how we can write our code so that it becomes more human-friendly. Again, R is going to read your code and basically perform the task no matter how it looks. It just runs through. It's a machine. It doesn't care about formatting or understanding what's going on. It's just going to do exactly what you tell it to do. However, a lot of times when you write code, you might have to come back to it months later, or someone else is going to have to look at it. And we want to make sure that anybody looking at our code understands what's going on. It's one of those things where if we take a little bit of time now to format our code to make sure it looks nice and it's understandable, it is doing a huge favor for future you or future whoever ends up having to make sense of whatever it is you coded previously. So, how do we do that? Well, we're going to talk about just a couple of general guidelines. First of all, when we name our objects, I think we should use snake case. That's my preferred method. I think that's the most clear and the most concise. That means we use our underscores. We use lowercase only. If you remember, there's other ways we can do it. You can use periods, or you can do the camel case where you make some things uppercase. Again, I don't think that's the best way to do it. I think snake case is the most concise and clear way to write your code. When we name objects, we always want to be descriptive but concise. So we want to make sure that when we name our objects, whether it's a variable or a function, we make sure that we know exactly what it is, but without taking up too much space. If your identifier ends up being 30 characters long, that's probably too long. See if you can try to abbreviate something or shorten it up somehow. Also, again, with your identifiers, your functions are your verbs, right? Your functions do something. Your functions perform an action, so make sure when you name them that you're actually using verbs that describe what is happening, what is going on, what is the operation, what is the action. And then data, well, data should be your nouns, right? Your data is not doing anything. Your data is your data, so make sure that you just use nouns to describe your data. When it comes to control flow, we always use braces to separate out our instructions. And when we use braces, the open ones appear at the end of a line of code. So, for example, the code down here at the bottom, I have a control flow question. If my value is dog, well then what I want for my code, well, okay, my actual operation, my control flow, right, my instructions, my code block. So I start with my brace, my open squiggly bracket, and that's always going to show up at the end of the line of code. All right, so we want to make that the end of the line of code. Then your actual code block or your body of code, your instructions, should be on its own line, starts on its own line. And again, you might have multiple lines in your code block, right? You might have to pipe or do a bunch of different things, but again, it should start on its own line. It needs to be indented in so that you can see that it's part of that if statement, that it is part of the if statement right there. And in this case, my block would be to display the message, you like dogs. And then we need our ending brace. And your ending brace is going to be the first or the only symbol on a line. So again, the open one where we start, that is the last symbol on your line of code. The closing one needs to be the first line. And again, with the block of code in the middle. Now, this is a if statement, which means there's also the other condition, which would be the else. And yeah, we follow that same idea, right? The open appears as the last symbol. Then you have your code block on its own line. And then the ending brace is the first symbol on the next line, which in this case would also be the only symbol on that line. And that's the way we really want to format any sort of control flow problem, whether it's, again, an if statement, an if else, or case when, or even when we make our own functions. If there's any set of instructions or code block, this is the way we want to do it. Now, again, there are ways to make it a little bit shorter or a little bit more concise. We can do it quicker. But for now, let's absolutely do it this way. All right, general guidelines. So if your code starts getting too long, if your line gets really long and it starts wrapping back on itself, make it into separate lines so that it is coherent and it is readable. We also can omit argument names if there's very common arguments for functions. So in this one I have ggplot, my data is pets, my mapping is my aesthetic function, and then I'm going to make looks like a scatter plot with my geom point. Well, this is very difficult to read. It's all over the place. If we want to make it more friendly for humans to read and understand what's going on, that's not the way to do it. What I want to do instead is use indenting, use separate lines, and try to organize as best I can. So again, I'm going to take my pets data frame, I'm going to pipe it into ggplot. And again, I think that's just the best way to do it is to use the piping function, as long as it's not too much. If you have to pipe like 10 times, well, yeah, split it up and split it up into separate operations or whatever you need to do, kind of create intermediate data frames. Because if you have a bunch of pipes all chained together, that's not typically a great way to write code either. But in this case, again, we're piping just one thing in to ggplot. Instead of saying mapping equals aesthetic, it's pretty well known that your mapping is done by that aesthetic function, which would be your next argument after you pipe it in. And then we have x, y, and color. And again, what I wanted to do in this case is that since we started running onto that next line, the color, I'm going to put it on its own line, space it all the way over so that it is lined up with the height and the weight so that I know, okay, this is part of my aesthetic function. This is not some separate thing. It is part of aesthetics because it is indented in. It's where all of my other arguments are for x and y and so on. And similarly with geom_point. Again, I'm adding that next layer to ggplot. I have it indented a little bit. I'm doing size, shape, and the transparency, which is alpha. And again, because I started running onto the next line, I'm going to bring alpha all the way over so that it lines up with the other arguments from geom_point. And this is a much more readable way to do it. So again, R doesn't care. R will run the code both ways, and you're going to get the same exact output at the end. But if someone's trying to look through your code later on, which might be you, do future you a favor and try to write it as neatly as possible so that there is understanding. All right. Another important thing to do is write comments in your code, because again, when you look through just code, it can be very difficult to understand what's going on and why. And I'm sure you've already run into that as you're reading your textbook and you're like, oh my God, what does all this mean? Because you're literally reading another language, and to become fluent in another language takes quite a while. And even when you become fluent, there's different dialects or different styles that people use. So comments are very, very useful to explain why you are doing a certain piece of code. When you comment your code, typically what we want to do is, well, do it on its own line. It comes before the actual function you want to do, unless, again, sometimes you just want to write a small little message and you can put it at the end of your line being like, okay, this is this data set or whatever. But again, typically we want to put it above and before our code block. We always start our comments with the number sign or the pound sign or the hashtag, depending on how old you are, I guess, right? That changes what you call it. And you want to describe the why. You don't want to necessarily describe the what or the how. You want to describe, why am I doing this? What was the point of this code block, so that you understand why you even wrote that code to begin with. So in this case, I took my Gapminder data frame and I was filtering by the year 2007, and then I wanted to summarize the mean life expectancy as the mean. Okay, so this code was calculating the mean life expectancy in 2007. That's why this code was written. That's why we have that block. And now that I can see that, I can look and like, okay, in my comment, that's what this particular code block does. Good, I know what it does, and I don't have to try to decipher later on what's going on. Basically, you're making comments in English so that you understand the code in that other language R. All right, so those are just some very quick, brief guidelines for writing your own code. So make sure you can answer the following questions. Question number 1, how do we set up the braces for our control flow operations? Where does the open one go? Where does the closed one go? Where does our body, where do our instructions go, type of thing. Number 2, how should we comment our code? How do I do it? Where should I put it? What should my comment describe? And then the last question, what guidelines should we follow when naming our specific objects, whether it's our data or our functions? All right, so hopefully we took some good ideas away from that will help make our code go a little bit smoother. And as always, take care of yourselves.